Good evening, everyone. I'm really glad to be back speaking with Seyed Mohammad Marandi, I consider him a very good friend, but also someone I think who always provides very valuable insights into regional events and regional developments, which are, of course, particularly important, bearing in mind the 9 months of genocide that the Zionist entity has been carrying out in the occupied Palestinian territories and, of course, the majority in Gaza. Seyed Mohammad Marandi, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Let's start with the elections. There has been a lot of commentary, even among those that could be considered to be friends of the resistance axis and of Iran, that the election, the democratic election of President Pezeshkian, sorry if I mispronounced that.
No, you pronounced it correctly.
Thank you. Is a blow for Iran. And there are a lot of kind of doom and gloom analysis circulating that he is harking back to a government which will pivot back towards the West, towards the nuclear deal, and who will, if you like, take Iran in another direction. What's your analysis of what actually just happened in Iran with the elections?
I disagree completely. It's very interesting that whenever there's an election in Iran, it's always a defeat for the country. No matter whether the turnout is high. If it's high, it's a defeat. If it's low, it's a defeat. If one side wins, it's a defeat. If it's the other side that wins, it's a defeat. Western narratives on Iran are always negative, so it doesn't matter what happens. They will interpret it in a way to make it look as if it's something awful and it's another sign of the so-called regime collapsing. So I, in general, would say ignore Western media, don't even follow Western media, unfollow them, and look for alternative news outlets for information about the world. If the Western media says something about Venezuela, don't believe it. If they say something about Cuba, don't believe them. Be suspicious, at least. And the same is true with Iran and the axis of resistance. President Pezeshkian, his election, first of all, shows that within Iran there's a diversity of choices, there's a democratic process. We had 6 candidates who were on using public television. Each of them had many hours where they could speak to the public on their own, or their representatives spoke to the public, or their representatives debated one another. And then the candidates themselves had 20 hours of debates with one another. And then in the second round, we had the 2 final candidates also debating one another on live television and using very harsh language, and their views on different issues were very different. So in that respect, it is a success. On the other hand, for someone to say that this is a blow to the Islamic Republic, that would, I think, the fact that people voted for Dr. Pezeshkian, I think that itself is a somewhat problematic approach to take, because if it's a blow to the Islamic Republic, then it is acknowledging the power of the presidency. So whenever they want to criticize Iran, or often when they want to criticize Iran, or before the elections, they were saying the elections doesn't mean anything. All of the power is in the hands of the leader. But then, on the other hand, they say this was a blow to the Islamic Republic, the fact that he was elected. So which is it? If it's just a game or a show, then how is this a defeat? If it's real, then Iran, how can you say that Iran is a dictatorship where people have no say? All of these Western narratives are simply propaganda. And they're often very inconsistent, as I pointed out in this case. But what makes them believable is that they're all negative and they fit within that broader narrative or that reservoir of knowledge on Iran, which is always negative. So even if the news on Iran is, it's sort of like saying on the one hand, the regime is collapsing, it's evil, it's hated, it's unpopular, it's corrupt. But on the other hand, it's a rising menace, it's a threat to the world. It wants to capture the whole of West Asia. If it's falling apart, how in the world are they going to, conquer West Asia? So, but both of these arguments, both of these narratives are believable because they're both negative, right? So, in general, I tend to ignore anything that they say.
Yeah,
President Pezeshkian,
sorry, go on.
yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, what was interesting for me, I mean, this opinion to some degree was also coming, as I said, from areas where we would consider them to be allies of or friends of Iran and the Islamic Republic. So this is why I was also a little bit surprised that strong voices that are pro the resistance axis, pro Russia, pro China, pro Iran, were voicing this fear that the election of President Pezeshkian was not necessarily a blow, but it was, I think I saw someone describe it as a dark day for the Islamic Republic. And then basically returning to the conspiracy theories about the helicopter crash with President Raisi. So I guess, what differences do you perceive there will be between the governance of President Pezeshkian and his administration and, for example, President Raisi? Is there going to be, I mean, we're seeing statements from the president-elect of solidarity with the resistance. He's reached out to Sayed Hassan Nasrallah. He appears to really be making an effort to reaffirm Iran's allegiance to the axis of resistance, and to both Saeed Jalili, his closest contestant. I don't mean contestant, do I? That sounds like some kind of TV game. Sorry, you know what I mean.
His rival, his
yes, that's the word. So we're seeing something that actually, again, we never see in the West. I mean, we don't see Keir Starmer sitting down with Rishi Sunak to discuss the future policy that is best for the region and for the UK, right? So how do you perceive it unfolding now to kind of counter these doom and gloom voices, even from our side, if you want to describe it in this way?
Well, first of all, the people who supported Dr. Pezeshkian were very diverse. And he said that anyone can join my campaign, but at the end of the day, I make my decisions about policy. So a lot of the people who joined his campaign are people who have had a history of being Western oriented or Western leaning, but a lot of people are not like that in his campaign team. In his campaign team, as I said, is actually quite diverse, which can be interpreted in a positive way or a negative way. But I'm not looking at them. I'm not looking, for example, President Rouhani supported him. I don't have any sympathy, or I'm not a fan of President Rouhani. Or Dr. Zarif supported him. I'm not, I know Dr. Zarif. I consider him to be a friend, but I have very differing views on many issues with Dr. Zarif. But what is important for me is what President-elect Pezeshkian has said himself.
Yeah.
When it comes to foreign policy, he has said He has shown great respect for General Soleimani on the last day of on the last debate. And then he also said that we are open to negotiations with the West over the nuclear deal, but if the West doesn't make the right decisions, then we will pursue other options. That is exactly what President Raisi did. President Raisi, unlike President Rouhani before him, who basically put all his eggs in the JCPOA or the nuclear deal basket and hurt the country badly. President Raisi, what he did was he began an effort to expand ties with countries across the globe, across the global south, Asia, Latin America, Africa. He joined BRICS. He joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He improved ties significantly with Turkmenistan, and their gas is going to be exported to Iran now. Russian gas is going to be exported to Iran. Iran is building the north-south corridor linking Russia and Central Asian countries to the Persian Gulf. Iran has become much more active in the Belt and Road Initiative, thus linking Iran to Central Asia and China and linking them through Iran to the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. So President Raisi's focus was on strengthening Iran's position across the world and especially with the global south, but he also engaged in talks, and we almost had a nuclear deal 2 years ago when I was in Vienna. I was a part of those talks. And so what, and it was the Americans that ultimately backed out 2 years ago. So we almost had a deal. The Europeans, the Joseph Borrell said Iranian demands were reasonable. We're waiting for the Americans to make a decision so we can move on. And at that time, I thought I was going to go back to Vienna for the signing ceremony, but that never happened because then the riots took place, and these, Iranians supported by the Americans were trying to create unrest in different cities in Iran. And the Americans miscalculated. They thought that the Islamic Republic was weak when it never was. It is extremely powerful and extremely popular, as we've seen through the funerals of President Raisi.
Yeah.
But they miscalculated, and we didn't have an agreement. And I also gave this example, which some of Mr. Jalini's supporters have become very angry at me for saying this, but it's a fact that Dr. Jalini did not support the negotiations that were taking place in Vienna and did not support the course taken by Dr. Bagheri, who is currently the acting foreign minister. So what I was saying is that if we look at the statements made by President-elect Pezeshkian and compare them to the actions and statements of President Raisi when it comes to foreign policy, we don't see any difference. Now, maybe in the months ahead, years ahead, each person will have their own style of governance, and maybe we'll see differences. But in principle, I don't see any difference. The first statement, as you alluded to, that he made, the first international message that he sent was to Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. He said he stands with the resistance to the very end. He will stand with them till the very end. He called the Israeli regime illegitimate, and he said, you will be victorious. So why should we be worried about the axis of resistance? I haven't seen the news myself, but I've been told that he spoke to Mr. Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas. So why should people show concern? Yes, he's going to have his own ministers. He's going to have his own government, and every single president will have their own style. But when we look at what he has said in the final debate and what he's said or what he's written over the last 2-3 days, I don't see any reason whatsoever why anyone who supports the resistance should be concerned. I consider President Pezeshkian to be a very moderate reformist. He's even called himself a principalist, and I think he's center in Iranian politics. He's not like Dr. Mr. Dr. Rouhani or Mr. Khatami, who who were more liberal. In fact, Mr. Khatami was one of the hardliners in the 1980s and the 1990s, and he and many of his people flipped around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and Saddam's defeat, when, around the time when Fukuyama spoke about the end of history, many of these hardliners in the 1980s and the 1990s in Iran flipped and became liberals. But Dr. AC is not a liberal, and he's not Rouhani. And what he has said so far is very much in line with the policies, the stated policies of Dr. Raisi. Is he going to be the same person? Of course not. No two people, as I said earlier, are the same. But when we look at what he's said and what he's saying at face value, then I think it's fair to say that Iran's foreign policy is a foreign policy of continuity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, his message actually was that the support for resistance front is rooted in Iran's core policy. So, I mean, that's a very strong message to send. As you said, his first political statement. Let's turn now to the actual resistance axis front, because I think the looming hot zone, of course,
and let me just add one thing before you go there, and that is that with regards to the nuclear deal, I think everyone in Iran recognizes that the 2015 nuclear deal was flawed. And I was there too when it was being negotiated. And Obama violated the deal from day one. Then Trump tore up the deal, and the Americans paid no price for it, no political price, nothing. And I think people in Iran recognize that the negotiating process was deeply flawed. Otherwise, it wouldn't have ended that way. And then 2-3 years ago, under President Raisi, negotiations were restarted, but the Iranians took a much stronger position at the negotiating table. They wanted a deal that would be protected so that the Americans couldn't cheat Iran again. And we almost got there. Of course, Iran made some concessions. The other side made many more concessions. And they were on the verge of having a deal. Now, have no doubt that if there are negotiations with the West today, Iran is stronger today than it was 2-3 years ago. The West is in trouble. They're in trouble in East Asia. They're in trouble in Ukraine. They're in trouble in the region. They're in trouble at home. So if they want to do a deal with Iran, they're going to have to meet Iran's needs. They have to be more flexible. And Dr. Pezeshkian said so he's willing to find a solution, just like Dr. Raisi was, but they have to recognize that this is not 2015, and Iran has learned from the mistakes of the past and the dishonesty of the West, that it has to be very careful about any deal that it signs.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's, as I said, come to what's happening in the region. I mean, today, on the road from Damascus to Beirut, there was another Israeli assassination of the former bodyguard of Seyed Hassan Nasrallah. The conflict between Hezbollah and the Zionist entity has been gradually increasing and increasing. Of course, Hezbollah is still trying to a degree contain it and prevent it expanding deeper into Lebanon itself. The Israelis for 9 months have been issuing rhetoric of an invasion, a ground invasion, reducing Beirut to Gaza, etc., but they haven't actually really acted on what they're saying. In your opinion, do you think this is going to expand into a regional war? Do you think it's going to be contained? Is it dependent upon, the endlessly failed ceasefire agreements, not because of Hamas not accepting the agreement, but of course down to Netanyahu being deceitful and duplicitous as always? Are we facing an escalation in Lebanon? And if so, where will Iran stand? And of course, we know where the resistance axis members stand. They've already made it very clear that they will come to the aid of Hezbollah and the resistance factions inside Lebanon. So how do you see it unraveling now?
I think there's a high possibility that the Israelis will carry out a major attack on Lebanon within the next few weeks. Not an all-out war, but heavy airstrikes and a sort of blitzkrieg attack on the country, and to take the south, or to at least force Hezbollah to relinquish the south. But we have to look back and see what happened. On October the 7th, the Israelis were humiliated. It showed that their intelligence is weak, even if one was to believe that, like many believe 9/11, that there were elements within the U.S. government that allowed 9/11 to happen. There are people who are saying the same thing about Gaza, saying that the prime minister of the Israeli regime allowed it to happen. Regardless of whether we give merit to that argument or not, Israel was humiliated. The regime itself failed to stop Hamas. The regime, therefore, its intelligence gathering capabilities, its military capabilities are much less effective than they had claimed. And now, after nine months, the regime has failed to take a dot on the map called the Gaza Strip. So this is not the Israeli regime of 1973 or 1982 or 1967. It is a failed regime. It is a weak and vulnerable regime that is fully dependent on the West to sustain its existence. Day and night, the British, the Americans, the Europeans are sending weapons and financial support so that they can continue the genocide, so that they can continue the Holocaust in Gaza. But this itself has destroyed the Israeli image across the world. Israel is hated across the world. I've been to China and Russia and other countries over the last 8-9 months, and the contempt for Israel is very widespread everywhere. And of course, even in the West, despite the fact that the media and the political establishment is fully in the hands of the Israeli lobby and Zionist supporters. But even in the West, people are turning against the regime. The rest of the world, it's much more hostile. The rest of the world is much more hostile towards the regime. So the regime has lost on all fronts. It has lost the intelligence gathering war. It has lost the military war. It has lost the propaganda war. It has lost its legitimacy in the eyes of the global public opinion. And this is something I think that will ultimately lead to the death of the regime. The regime is in its final years. And then we had Ansarullah, which perhaps did something much greater than what Hamas and the resistance did. They defeated the superpower in the Red Sea, and they did it to help the people of Gaza. They did it to stop the genocide. So Ansarullah is victorious. Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other allied groups are victorious. Hezbollah in the north is victorious. The Israelis, after 9 months, have not been able to stop Hezbollah. And we've seen how Hezbollah gathers intelligence and how its drones fly over Israel, and they can do nothing about it. So, and then we have the Iraqi resistance and the Syrian resistance, but the Iraqi resistance in particular has the ability to destroy U.S. forces and U.S. interests in Iraq. And that not only are they striking the Israeli regime from Iraq, but they are also a threat to the United States. So the Americans, if they want to join the Israeli regime in the genocide more openly, they know that they will lose everything in Iraq. And that is huge. So the Americans are in a very tight position. So the Israelis have lost the war. The Americans have lost the war. The West has lost the war. Their masks have come off. The world sees the West for what it really is, a series of brutal and barbaric and medieval regimes that openly support ethno-supremacism, genocide, and apartheid. And all the mainstream journalists and all the diplomats that are in these Western embassies across the world, they are all mercenaries for genocide. So the West has been destroyed, completely destroyed. They have nothing to say anymore to the rest of the world. They cannot even criticize North Korea. They cannot criticize anyone because they are the worst of the worst. And all of their journalists and all of their politicians and their elites, they're all complicit in genocide. They're all a part of this Holocaust. So the West Israel has destroyed the West, and that's, I think, the best reason why many of us are saying that the Israeli regime is not an asset for the West. It is, uh, it is harmful for the West. It is a burden to the West. The Israeli regime is bringing about the downfall of the West in the eyes of the rest of the world. So, in my opinion, the failure is on all fronts and on all at all levels. So, does anyone seriously believe that if the Israeli regime attacks Lebanon, it will win? Of course not. Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas and the other groups. Hezbollah right now is fighting at a disadvantage. It is fighting on the border because it does not want to have ordinary Lebanese involved. It does not want to create a burden for them. So they're making extra sacrifices. They're sacrificing their own young volunteers who are forced to fight in a very tight space, in a very small space, so that the war doesn't expand to involve other people. So they want to put pressure on the Israeli regime, but keep the pressure off the people of Lebanon to keep the country united, right? And why is Hezbollah doing this? It wants to help the people of Gaza. It wants to prevent the Israeli regime from focusing on Gaza. So Hezbollah is making huge sacrifices for the people of Gaza, but also for the people of Lebanon.
Yeah.
They want to let the Lebanese out of it. They want to keep their own opponents from being hurt. But if the Israeli regime attacks Lebanon, if it carries out this blitzkrieg, then Hezbollah will be fighting at an advantage because they have tunnels underground across the south and central and north of Lebanon. They have very powerful weapons all across Lebanon. Their fighters will be underground for the most part, very well protected. The Israeli Air Force will be limited in what it can do. And it knows very little about Hezbollah's capabilities, just as we found out in Gaza. The Israelis did not know about the capabilities in Gaza that the Iranians and the resistance and the Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others built. They knew very little about it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have initiated this foolish and lost war. They've succeeded in carrying out a Holocaust, but they failed on the battlefield. They have gained nothing on the battlefield. Hamas today is, if it isn't stronger than what it was on October the 7th, it's not weaker. Whereas the Israeli regime, its economy has collapsed. Many people have left the country, and it's only going to get worse. No one will ever invest in Israel again because they know that this is not a stable place. They know that this land cannot be safe for future investors. So Israel and many elites in Israeli living in Israel will leave because many of these industries will no longer be able to sustain themselves in that land. But if Israel attacks Hezbollah, then Hezbollah will be able to hit back very hard. And who can hit harder, Israel or Hezbollah? Israel, of course, has greater firepower, but Hezbollah is underground. The resistance is underground. And now we see others joining Hezbollah in large numbers. People who are Palestinians and many Sunni Lebanese, they are joining the resistance and becoming a part of the resistance. Hezbollah is growing more powerful. And after the Iranian strikes on Israel, on the Israeli regime, the Israelis have refrained from carrying out many attacks on Syria, and a lot has gone into Syria and Lebanon. So Lebanon is prepared. And also, Israel has many more vulnerable targets than does Hezbollah, than does Lebanon. Lebanon doesn't have a great infrastructure, as you know, because it's been impoverished for years, because it's been invaded before by the Israeli regime in 1982, because the West doesn't allow Lebanon to grow. The West doesn't even allow Lebanon to have an air force or surface-to-air missiles. They want to keep it vulnerable to Israel. But Lebanon doesn't even have electrical power plants like Israel does. So if Hezbollah strikes an electrical power plant in Israel, then it will have a huge impact on life in that land, in occupied Palestine. But if Israel strikes what sort of power plants does Lebanon have? There are so many factories. There's so many key uh, uh, key infrastructural uh, uh, targets that Hezbollah can strike and destroy the Israeli economy, that the Israeli regime will never be able to go back to normal. Even now, it can't go back to normal. But after Hezbollah is done with the Israeli regime, then it will be finished. Whereas all Israel can do really to Lebanon is bomb houses, bomb apartment buildings, because Lebanon doesn't have the key infrastructure that the Israeli regime has. So it will be a catastrophic. The Israeli regime will target civilians. We know that they are barbaric animals, and the West will justify it. They will bomb high civilian targets, and they'll say they're terrorists inside, and the Western media will mimic whatever and repeat whatever the Israelis say, because the BBC, CNN, Fox News, The Guardian, The Independent, the New York Times, Washington, they're all supporters of genocide. They're all supporters of Israeli atrocities. They will never say, if the Israelis, we've now heard from credible sources that almost as we believed from this, and as we've been saying from the start, that the casualties and the death rate in Gaza is much higher than the official rate. Now we know that, according to some numbers, that there could be up to 200,000 people that have died. The West will, and the Western media and Western diplomats and Western elites will allow this to continue till 2 million Gazans are dead. They don't care. They're racist. And they will allow the Israeli regime to do the same in Lebanon, and they'll justify it.
Yeah.
But the Israeli regime will be hit so hard by Hezbollah and by Hezbollah's allies and by the collective resistance. By the collective resistance, it won't just be Lebanon, have no doubt about that. Israel will pay an unbelievably high price, and it will lose. And the defeat will be much greater than the defeat that it's already experienced. So it could get very bloody. They will target women and children because they are barbaric animals, but they will lose. And they will lose in a way in which they will never be able to get over.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the media. I'm sure you're aware of the Telegraph article where they claimed that anonymous sources had told them that Hezbollah was storing weapons at the Rafik Hariri airport in Beirut, which is tantamount to justification for Israel to bomb a civilian airport. Of course, they've already bombed civilian airports here in Damascus and in Aleppo, as you well
Of
know.
course, and they'll always call them strongholds. And when
Yes,
they bomb civilian targets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the BBC, Sky News, all the Times, all of them, the French, the Germans, they will all say these are Hezbollah strongholds. They'll try as hard as possible to be apologetic and to justify all the crimes committed by the racist Israeli regime. Why? Because the West has not changed from what it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300. These are the same racist, Eurocentric, supremacist people who've been governing Europe and North America for centuries and who've been carrying out atrocities across the world for centuries. They have not changed. They are no different. The only difference is that now they're doing it in front of a global audience that is shocked, that is looking on, and they cannot believe what they're seeing day and night, 24 hours a day. They're massacring women and children. Look at all those Western feminists and all those NGOs for human rights. They've all shut up. They've all been quiet. They've all gone away. They used to bark day and night about human rights and about how our part of the world and everywhere else in the world, how we have to learn from the civilized Europeans. Where are they now? They've all disappeared. All of the Western media outlets, they are trying desperately to draw attention away from Gaza. We just saw what happened in Ukraine, where apparently a surface-to-air missile struck a building, and they're blaming the Russians and making a big deal out of it. Whereas what's going on in Gaza is thousands of times, tens of
yeah.
thousands of times worse, but they won't talk about it because they are racist, because the Western media is not a free media. It is not the free world. This is the same evil empire that has been ruling over the rest of the world for hundreds of years. But now it is collapsing because the rest of the world will not tolerate them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the other point to make is that the resistance axis has developed resilience over, as you said, decades, even centuries of resisting neocolonialism and resisting the Zionist barbarism and savagery. But Israel has never, or the occupied territories have never faced a war on their territory, as you said, trading, bomb for bomb and attack for attack against infrastructure. And it's important for people to understand that Hezbollah has never targeted so far, and Iran didn't either, any civilian infrastructure. They've been targeting exclusively military infrastructure and installations. But as you said, if Israel is to escalate, and as it always does, as Al-Qaeda has done in Syria, if they target civilian infrastructure, civilian homes, civilian residences, then the retaliation is going to be savage. And this is the first time that Israel has faced a war of this length, 9 months. And if they push into Lebanon, how long is it going to last? This is the point. They never faced this situation before.
And here I think I have to remind people that the great mover of things was Ayatollah Khamenei. He has been building up the resistance and supporting the resistance for decades. And the people of Iran have made many sacrifices. The maximum pressure sanctions is because of Iran's support for the Palestinian people. The West has been abusing Iran and attacking Iran and harming Iran through sanctions, through war, through terrorism, through and attempting to create instability through psychological warfare, through media propaganda and media campaigns for decades, simply because Iran supports the people of Palestine. And now we see that the resistance has grown to a degree where the Israeli regime and its Western allies are in deep trouble. And everyone in the resistance, whether it's Hezbollah or Ansarullah or the Hashid in Iraq, everyone is making, and Iran, of course, everyone is making sacrifices for the people of Palestine. And I think that is very admirable. And we have to remember General Soleimani and the role that he played in developing the capabilities of the resistance in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria. And we have to remember the sacrifices made by the Syrian people,
Yes.
and their allies in Syria. We imagine if the Americans who led this dirty war against Syria, if they had won, and people, these oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf and American allies in the region, and sadly, Mr. Erdogan, and if these people had won, the war in Gaza today would be a very different type of war. Syria is key to, and has always been the key, and that was the reason why they carried out the dirty war. That's why they created ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria, uh, and other extremist groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam and so on and so forth. It was all to bring down Syria. Erdogan would get a piece of the cake. Maybe the Jordanian dictatorship would get a piece of the cake. But they would create chaos in Syria, and all these fanatics and who are being funded, who have been funded by these pro-American regimes, all of them would tear the country apart. And then how would the resistance be able to be supported? What would things be like in Gaza today if Syria had fallen? So the sacrifices made by the Syrian people, by Hezbollah in Syria, by the Hashid in Syria, by the Iranians in Syria, by the Afghan volunteers in Syria, all of these have today led to the Israeli regime being desperate. And it has led to the defeat of this ethno-supremacist apartheid regime that was also deeply involved in the dirty war in Syria. So General Soleimani, Ayatollah Khamenei, and many people, and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and the leaders of Ansarullah and the Hashid, and of course Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and all the resistance groups, the military, the political, the activists, wherever they are. And now it is a global movement. The resistance, not just the axis of resistance in the region, but we see Jews in North America protesting against the Israeli regime. We see Hindus in India protesting the regime. This resistance is truly now a global resistance, and it is really a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to point out that those states that have effectively normalized with the Zionist regime through their own regimes, who were also in some cases responsible, of course, for the dirty war against Syria.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
you're seeing you're seeing a population.
Yes, I just wanted to point out
yes.
that Turkey, that Erdogan, which has sent billions of dollars, of tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons and support for these terror groups in Syria, he has done nothing for Gaza. He has not even broken off ties with the Israeli regime. Turkish goods are still being exported to Israel as we speak, and the same is true with Jordan. They were supporting, this Jordanian regime was supporting the terrorists in the south, but they are preventing anyone from harming Israeli regime interests in Jordan. So when it comes to hurting the resistance, they did all they could, and they're still doing it. They're still doing it as we speak. In Idlib, the Syrian army, as their war is raging near its borders and alongside its borders in the south, they have to fight these terrorists that are still being funded by Mr. Erdogan and his allies in the Persian Gulf region. And of course, we have the American occupation and and their mercenaries in Syria too, all trying to draw away Syrian armed forces so that they cannot be strong against the enemy. And of course, the Jordan is doing the same. So everyone has been exposed.
Yeah.
Everyone has been exposed. All those who've been pretending to be friends of Palestine have been shown to be friends of the genocidal Israeli regime. And those who sincerely supported the Palestinian people are today being seen as making sacrifices to help the people of Gaza, to save the people of Gaza. And ultimately, the people of Gaza will be victorious. The people of Palestine will be victorious.
Yeah, and I think for me, the strongest message recently came from Ansarullah, who were offered, a very enticing incentive by the United States to back down on their blockade of the Red Sea. And their response was quite simply, if you think we can be bought to betray our principles and to betray the people of Palestine, you're crazy. And I think this was such a beautiful statement. I mean, I haven't done it justice. But I think it's also important to point out that even the regimes that have betrayed the resistance axis, not only recently, but for years, the people within those countries are not aligned with their government's policies of normalization with the Zionist entity. And you're seeing, as you talked about, the uprisings in the West against the genocidal policies of their own regimes in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, in the EU. The same thing is happening in those normalized countries. In Jordan, for example, the majority of the population is Palestinian. And in all these countries that have effectively betrayed over years the resistance, they're now facing the true revolution from their own people, from their own population. So you're absolutely right. What Gaza has done is to unite the peoples of the region after decades of the West trying to foment sectarian division, trying to turn even the Palestinian movement against Syria, for example. The Palestinian movement was weaponized against Syria. We know this. But it's failed because what Gaza has done and what this horrendous sacrifice of the Gazan people and the resistance and the people in the occupied territories that are also under attack, but it's much more below the radar. What it's done is to finally unify the people of the region in the understanding that they have to prevent this, that they have to prevent genocide.
And I think it's also important to note that the same offers that were made to Ansarullah, which were rejected, were also made to Hezbollah, and they were rejected. But imagine what the Americans and the West would be offering Iran.
Yeah.
They have offered Iran the world, but Iran will not relinquish its principles. Iran rejects ethno-supremacism. It rejects the humiliation of the Palestinian people, and it will stand with them until their liberation. So these countries, these entities, these groups, they are all making enormous sacrifices for principle. It's about human rights and human dignity, moral principles, and something which the West knows nothing about. The collective West rejects. They are opposed to they are the enemies of human rights and human dignity. And the people in the West, as you pointed out, they are now, many of them, a part of this resistance. They are standing up. You see young people in the United States and in Europe protesting regularly, people from all religions and all walks of life, who see through the propaganda and who are making sacrifices because they lose their jobs, they're expelled from universities. The West has removed the mask, this facade of freedom and democracy, and that's all gone. That's all gone. They've been exposed. They've been exposed as open supporters of apartheid, of racism, of racial and ethnic superiority and hierarchy. Everything, everything everything has all the masks that now that they've been removed, the collective West has shown itself to be morally inferior to the whole of the rest of the world. But the people of the West are a part of this resistance, or at least many people in the West, and it's growing every day that this genocide, that this Holocaust continues, makes it worse for the West. It makes it worse for the Israeli regime. It solidifies the belief across the world that the Israeli regime is completely illegitimate.
Absolutely. I think we should probably end there because it's the perfect ending. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're incredibly busy, so I really appreciate you speaking to me about these, events that are unfolding. And it would be great to catch up with you again, perhaps after we see what really happens in Lebanon, how it develops, and talk about it after that. And also, as we spoke about before, we started recording, everything that's happening in Syria also is very important for the region. So let's try and catch up not too far in the future.
Sure, it was great speaking to you, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
You too. Bye for now.